She was 42 years old, standing at the edge of a stranger's porch, with 2 battered suitcases and a last name she had borrowed from a man she barely knew. The 6 boys watching her from the doorway didn't speak. Neither did their father. The wind moved across the Texas flatland and pulled a loose strand of hair across her face, and Evelyn Hart thought, for just 1 second, about turning around, about walking back down that dirt road and never looking back. But she had nowhere left to go. And that, more than anything, was what kept her feet planted on that porch. If you've ever had to walk into a room where nobody wanted you, you know exactly what this story is about. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The advertisement had been 11 lines long. Evelyn had found it folded inside a community newspaper at the laundromat on Crane Street, tucked between a notice for a lost dog and a handwritten flyer for piano lessons. She almost missed it entirely. She had been waiting for the dryer to finish its cycle, sitting on a plastic chair with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, when the paper slid off the bench beside her and fell open to that page. Rancher, widower, 6 sons. Looking for a capable woman willing to work hard and help raise a family. Must be practical. No dreamers. Write to C. Dawson, Harlow County, Texas. She read it twice. Then she folded the paper, put it in her coat pocket, finished her cold coffee, and didn't think about it again for 3 days. On the 4th day, she wrote the letter. She didn't know what made her do it. It wasn't romance. She was too old and too tired for that kind of delusion. It wasn't desperation exactly, though desperation wasn't far from it. It was something quieter, a feeling she couldn't quite name, like a door she hadn't noticed before suddenly appearing in a wall she had stared at for years. Evelyn Hart had spent 20 of those 42 years working as a bookkeeper at a textile company in Abilene. She had been reliable, careful, and completely invisible. She had kept the accounts balanced, remembered every employee's birthday, and never once asked for a raise she didn't receive politely and in a slightly smaller amount than she'd hoped. She had lived alone in a rented apartment above a dry cleaner since her mother passed. She had a small savings account, a good pair of boots, and no family left to speak of. She was not a tragic figure. She never thought of herself that way. But she also understood, somewhere in the practical center of herself, that the life she had been living was not really a life she had chosen. It was just the shape that had formed around her when she wasn't paying attention. So she wrote the letter. She was honest in it, which she suspected might be a mistake. She told Caleb Dawson her age. She told him she had no experience with ranching, but that she was good with numbers and not afraid of hard work. She told him she didn't have illusions about what this kind of arrangement would look like. She told him she could be useful. He wrote back in 12 days. His letter was shorter than hers. He said she sounded sensible. He said he needed someone sensible. He said the nearest town was Decker's Mill, about 9 miles from the ranch, and that if she came and it didn't work, he'd pay the return fare. She took the bus to Texas in early April. Biked. The ranch appeared through the window of the hired truck like something that had been dropped from a height and left where it landed. The main house was 2 stories of weathered timber, its paint the color of old bone, with a porch that sagged on the left side and a screen door that hung at an angle suggesting the hinges had given up years ago. Behind it, a long cattle barn stretched toward a flat horizon, and beyond that, pasture rolled out in every direction without apology. It wasn't ugly, it just looked like a place that had been through something and hadn't entirely recovered. The truck driver left her at the end of the dirt road. She walked the last quarter-mile herself, carrying 1 suitcase in each hand, the dry April wind pushing grit into her eyes. She had dressed carefully that morning, her good gray blouse, the blue jacket she saved for occasions, her reliable boots. She looked, she suspected, exactly like what she was, a woman trying to make a decent impression on people who hadn't asked to meet her. She was halfway up the porch steps when the door opened. The man who stepped out was taller than she'd imagined. She hadn't imagined much, but still. He had the kind of face that had been weathered into something rough and specific, like wood left out in all 4 seasons. He was perhaps 50, with dark hair threaded through with gray, and he held himself the way men hold themselves when they've spent years carrying something heavy, not stooped, just settled under it. "Miss Hart," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Dawson." She set the suitcases down and extended her hand. He shook it. His grip was brief and firm, and he stepped back immediately to give her room on the porch, which she appreciated. "The boys are inside," he said. "They know you're coming." "That's good," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could feel him taking stock of her the same way she was taking stock of him. Practical, not unkind, but honest. "It's going to take them time," he said. "I want you to understand that going in. I expected as much. The older ones—" He stopped, started again. "Nathan's 18. He's been running the household since his mother passed. He's not going to make things easy for you." Evelyn picked up her suitcases. "I didn't come here expecting easy." Something in his expression shifted, barely enough to read. He pushed open the screen door and held it for her, and she walked inside. There were 5 of them in the kitchen when she entered, arranged with the kind of deliberate stillness that told her they had been waiting and had agreed, in that silent way children agree, on exactly how they would stand. The youngest was perhaps 7, round-faced and uncertain, clutching the edge of the table. Beside him, twins she guessed at 9 or 10, both with their father's dark eyes, both watching her with the same careful blankness. A boy of maybe 13 leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, already practicing the pose of someone who wasn't going to be moved. The 5th was 15 or so, and he gave her the only honest reaction, a flicker of open curiosity before he caught himself and looked away. The oldest was not in the kitchen. "Boys," Caleb said, "this is Miss Hart. She's going to be staying with us." The youngest, she would learn his name was Thomas, looked up at his father, then back at her. "Are you going to be our new mother?" he asked. The room went very still. "Thomas," the 13-year-old said sharply. Evelyn crouched down to be at the boy's level. "I'm Evelyn," she said. "That's all I am right now. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Thomas thought about that. Then he nodded, satisfied in the way only very small children can be satisfied, like he'd been given an answer that made sense to him even if it hadn't made sense to the room. She straightened up. The back door opened behind her. She turned. Nathan Dawson was 18 years old, and the first thing she noticed about him was his hands, rough and calloused, and too old for his age, the hands of a man who'd spent years doing the work of one. The second thing she noticed was the way he looked at her. Not with cruelty. Something worse than cruelty, a complete and settled refusal to acknowledge that her presence in this house was anything other than a mistake. He walked past her to the sink and began washing his hands. He didn't speak. "Nathan," Caleb said, a warning in his voice. "I heard the truck," Nathan said. He turned off the water and dried his hands on a towel. Then he looked at his father. Only his father. "The east fence took some damage last night. I need you out there this afternoon." He walked back out the door without looking at her again. The kitchen held its breath. "I'll get your room set up," Caleb said. The room was small. A single bed with a worn quilt, a dresser with a sticky third drawer, a window that looked out over the back pasture. Evelyn stood in it after Caleb left and spent a moment being honest with herself. The room was small, the house was broken in a dozen ways she'd already counted, and 5 of the 6 people who lived here would need weeks or months before they stopped flinching every time she entered a room. She opened her suitcase and began unpacking. She didn't allow herself to think about whether she'd made a mistake. That wasn't a useful thought. What was useful was understanding what she'd walked into, and she'd already started building the picture. The household accounts were a disaster. She'd learned this within her first hour of looking around, not by asking questions, but by reading the evidence the way a bookkeeper reads a room, the unpaid invoices pinned under a rock on the kitchen counter, the nearly empty feed canisters in the barn she could see from her window, the kitchen pantry she'd managed to glance at while Caleb was speaking with the twins. There were gaps where staples should have been, the kind of gaps that appeared slowly, quietly, the way debt appeared. Not all at once, but through a long series of small surrenders. She put her 2 good blouses in the dresser and laid her account ledger, she'd brought a blank one, on the top of the dresser for now. Then she went back downstairs to start dinner. The kitchen was not well organized. Pots lived in 2 different cabinets with no logic she could detect. The stove had a burner that required 3 matches instead of 1, and whoever had last restocked the shelves had clearly been operating under conditions of significant stress. But she found flour, salt, lard, dried beans, some wild garlic hung by the window. She found 4 eggs. She found half a ham hock in the icebox and a jar of blackstrap molasses she could use. She cooked in silence. The twins appeared at the kitchen door 3 times before Thomas finally came in and sat at the table and asked if he could help. "Can you stir without stopping?" she asked. "Yes," he said, serious. She gave him the beans to stir. They worked in silence for a while. Then Thomas said, without looking up, "Nathan says you won't stay." Evelyn turned the cornbread in the pan. "Nathan might be right," she said. Thomas looked up at her. "But I'm here now," she said, "so let's make supper." He went back to stirring, and she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move in something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't nothing. Dinner was awkward in the way that first meals between strangers who aren't sure what to say to each other are always awkward, which is to say, completely. The twins talked to each other in low voices. The 15-year-old, whose name she learned was Marcus, passed dishes with adequate politeness and said nothing else. The 13-year-old, whose name was Daniel, ate with his eyes on his plate and kept his arms folded in a way that was difficult to sustain around a dinner table, but which he managed anyway. Thomas ate everything in front of him and asked if there was more cornbread. Nathan sat at the far end of the table from her and ate with the focused efficiency of someone working through a task he wanted done quickly. He said nothing. He asked for nothing. When the meal was over, he stood, said "thank you for the food" to the table at large, not to her specifically, but at least to the air near her, and left the room. Caleb helped clear the table without being asked. That surprised her. "It was a good meal," he said. "The pantry's almost bare," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just fact. He set the plates beside the sink. Something tightened in his face. "I know." "I'd like to go over the accounts," she said. "Not tonight. When you have time." He turned to look at her directly. "You had one day," he said. "I worked in accounting for 20 years, she said. "I notice these things the way you notice a fence that needs mending. I'm not criticizing. I'd just like to understand what we're working with." He stood there a moment, and she could feel him deciding something. Then he nodded once. "End of the week," he said. "I'll pull out the ledgers." She turned to the sink and started washing the dishes. That night she lay in the small bed and listened to the ranch settle into dark. She could hear coyotes somewhere to the north. She could hear the loose screen door tapping in the wind. She could hear, from somewhere above her, the unmistakable sound of a young man who was trying very hard not to make noise. Nathan was moving around his room at midnight. She didn't know why. She didn't try to guess. She lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of a house that had been holding its grief like a wound that nobody had let her look at yet. And she thought about the word sensible, which was the word Caleb had used about her. And she thought that maybe sensible was exactly what a place like this needed. Not a miracle. Not a substitute for what was lost. Just someone willing to look at things directly and work with what was there. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was the kind of sleep that comes from exhaustion more than rest, heavy and without dreams. In the morning, she got up before everyone else and started the fire in the stove and put the coffee on, and she went out to the porch with her blank ledger and wrote the date at the top of the first page and began making notes about what she'd seen. The ranch was in trouble. That much was plain. But trouble, she had learned from 20 years of balancing books that other people had broken, was not the same as finished. Not yet. She looked out at the flat Texas morning, the sky going pale gold over the east pasture, and listened to the house begin to stir behind her. Thomas's feet on the floorboards, the creak of the stairs, one of the twins murmuring something, the distant sound of the cattle barn. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger and wrote 2 words at the top. "Start here." Then she picked up her pen and went to work. The ledgers were worse than she'd expected. Evelyn sat across from Caleb at the kitchen table on Friday evening after the younger boys had gone to bed, the lamp between them throwing a circle of yellow light over 3 years of paperwork that had been handled the way a drowning man handles everything, by grabbing what he could and letting the rest go under. She didn't comment on the disorder. She simply sorted, stacked, and began reading numbers in the quiet way she had always read numbers, like they were a language that told the truth, even when the person who'd written them had been trying not to look at it directly. Caleb sat with his coffee and watched her. He had not, she noticed, offered excuses. She credited him for that. You're 3 months behind on the feed supplier, she said. I know. And 4 on the equipment loan from Harlow County Bank. I know that too. She turned a page. The cattle sale last fall. You got below market price. I needed the cash fast. Herd was small. I didn't have leverage. She set the page down and looked at him. What happened to the herd? The numbers from 2 years ago show twice the cattle. Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. It was a habit, she was learning, something he did when he was deciding how much of a thing to tell. After Ruth passed, he said, I lost about 6 weeks. Just couldn't keep up with everything. Lost some to sickness I should have caught earlier. Sold some I shouldn't have sold to cover bills I should have managed differently. He paused. I made a lot of decisions in those 6 weeks that I'm still paying for. She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. She turned to a clean page in her ledger and began writing a column of numbers. The bank? She said. Is it a fixed loan or are they reviewing at renewal? He looked slightly surprised that she knew to ask that. Renewal. October. So we have 5 months to make the account look like something they'd want to continue. Or they call it. Yes, she said. Or they call it. She kept writing. After a moment, Caleb said, You make it sound manageable. I don't know yet if it is, she said. I'm going to tell you the truth when I do. That's all I can promise. He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight. There was something in his face she couldn't entirely read. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of relief maybe that someone was looking at the problem directly instead of around it. All right, he said. She turned back to the ledger and kept working until past 11. And when she finally went to bed, her hand ached from writing and her mind was still moving through numbers the way it did when a problem had its teeth in her, and she lay in the dark thinking about cattle prices and feed costs and what a struggling ranch could conceivably sell that it wasn't already selling. She thought about this garden she'd seen on the south side of the house, about an acre of it, completely untended, gone to weeds and dry soil. She thought about the women she'd seen at the small market in Decker's Mill when the hired hand, a quiet man named Pete, had driven her in for supplies 3 days ago. She thought about the smell of the pies she'd made from the last of the dried apples. And slowly, somewhere in the arithmetic of it, a shape began to form. She started with the garden because it was free. The first morning she went out with a hoe and a bad back and began working the soil at the near edge where the weeds were thinnest. Thomas appeared at the garden gate within 20 minutes, drawn by the noise or the curiosity, or both. He stood watching her for a while with his hands in his pockets. What are you doing? He asked. Breaking ground, she said. Hand me that smaller hoe by the post. He brought it to her. Then, without being asked, he picked up the trowel leaning against the fence and dropped to his knees at the nearest patch and began turning soil the way children do, enthusiastically and somewhat randomly. My mama had a garden, he said. I know, she said, though she didn't. She just knew it was the right answer. She grew tomatoes, he dug with the trowel. Nathan says you'll kill everything you plant because you don't know what you're doing. Evelyn kept working. Nathan might be right. Do you know what you're doing? Some of it, she said honestly. See, I grew up helping my mother with a kitchen garden. Tomatoes, beans, squash. Not on this scale, but the principles are the same. Soil, water, sun, time. Thomas considered that. Nathan knows a lot about ranching, he said. It wasn't an attack, just a statement, delivered with the fairness of a child who tries to give credit where it's due. I believe it, she said. He had to, Thomas said. After Mama died, Papa wasn't really here for a while, even when he was here. She stopped hoeing for just a second, then continued. That must have been hard on Nathan, she said carefully. It was hard on everyone. He kept digging. But mostly Nathan. He's the one who had to do everything. She filed that away and didn't push further. Thomas was 7 years old, and he'd just told her more about this family in 5 minutes than Caleb had in 5 days. And she understood that children offered these things freely and without knowing what they were giving, which meant she had to treat it with more care, not less. The market in Decker's Mill ran on Saturday mornings in the lot beside the feed store. Evelyn baked 3 pies on Friday night, 2 apple from the last of her dried stock, and 1 molasses pecan that she'd worked out from what was available in the pantry. She packaged them carefully, borrowed the wagon from Pete, and drove herself the 9 miles into town because she didn't want to ask Caleb for something he might refuse. He saw her loading the wagon at 6 in the morning. He was on his way to the barn. He stopped. "What's that?" "Pies," she said. He stood looking at the wagon, then at her. "You're selling them?" "Going to try." She could see him working through some response, whether to object, whether to say something about what it looked like. A woman from his ranch selling baked goods at the market, like she needed to. Small towns had opinions about things like that. "You'll need a table," he said finally, and went to the barn and came back 10 minutes later with a folding table and helped her load it without another word. She sold all 3 pies by 9:30. The molasses pecan went first, to a large woman in a sun hat who tasted the sample Evelyn offered and said, "Well, that's something," in a tone that was the highest compliment the situation allowed. Evelyn took the woman's name, Marge Fielding, and said she'd have another one next week if she wanted to put in an order. Marge Fielding looked her over carefully. "You're the woman out at the Dawson place," she said. "I am." Marge's expression was not unfriendly, exactly, but it was measuring. Ruth Dawson was a good woman. "I've heard as much," Evelyn said. "You're not here to replace her, I suppose?" "No," Evelyn said. "I'm not." Marge seemed to accept that as the only honest possible answer. She paid for the pie and said she'd take 2 next week. The women at the market were not unkind to her face, but she overheard, while she was breaking down her table, a conversation between 2 women near the coffee cart that stopped her hands for just a moment. "Dawson's new wife, or near enough. How old do you think she is?" "Old enough to know better, I'd say. 6 boys and a man who hasn't been right since Ruth died. What's she thinking?" "She's thinking she had nowhere else to go, more likely." Evelyn finished folding the table, loaded it into the wagon, and drove the 9 miles home without rushing. She let the words settle into the part of her that was hard enough to hold them without cracking, and she thought, they're not entirely wrong. That's the thing about that kind of talk. It's almost always partially true, which is what makes it sting. What they didn't know, what she was still learning herself, was that having nowhere else to go didn't make you weak. Sometimes it made you the most determined person in the room. Mausit. She found the first sign of real trouble on a Tuesday. She had been working her way through the older invoices, the ones shoved in the back of the drawer Caleb had given her access to, and she found a letter from Harlow County Bank dated 2 months prior. It was not the routine renewal notice she'd expected. It was a formal warning, the kind that used specific legal language and referenced specific clauses, notifying Caleb Dawson that due to consecutive missed payments and insufficient demonstrated revenue, the bank was initiating a preliminary review of the loan with possible early termination proceedings. Possible early termination was not a gentle phrase. It meant that if the bank decided the ranch was not viable, they could call the full balance due before October, which would mean the ranch was finished. Not struggling, finished. She sat with the letter for a long time. Then she went looking for Caleb. She found him in the cattle barn with Nathan, both of them working on a section of fence rail that had rotted through. She stood at the barn door until Caleb looked up. "When you have a minute," she said. He read something in her face. "Nathan, finish that section," he said, and followed her outside. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. She watched his jaw go tight, then tighter. "Where did you find this?" he said. "Back of the invoice drawer, under some receipts from last year. I put it there." "I know." He looked at her. There was something raw in his expression that she didn't think he'd intended to show. The look of a man who had put a dangerous thing somewhere he didn't have to see it every day, and who had just been handed it back. "You weren't going to deal with it," she said. It wasn't a question or a judgment, just the statement of a fact they both needed to look at. "I was going to deal with it," he said. "I just didn't know how." "Okay," she said. "So now we figure out how together." She took the letter back from him. "But I need you to stop putting things in drawers, Caleb. Every piece of paper that goes in a drawer is something I can't help you with." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with some difficulty, "I'm not used to having someone else involved in this. I understand that." "It's my ranch." "Yes," she said. "It is." And I'm not trying to take it from you. I'm trying to help you keep it. She folded the letter. Those are two different things. He looked out at the pasture, his hands on his hips, and she could see him breathing through something. It wasn't anger at her, she thought. It was the harder thing. The anger of a man who had been managing alone for so long that the presence of help felt, in some ways, like an accusation. The bank, she said. I'd like to request a meeting with them. Go over the accounts, show them a plan. I've been working on projections, what the garden can produce, what the pies bring in, what a modest herd increase would do to the fall numbers. It's not a miracle, but it's a real set of numbers. He turned back to her. You already built a plan. A rough one. I needed to see the letter first to know how urgent it was. And? Urgent, she said plainly, but not impossible. There's a difference. He stared at the letter in her hand for a long moment. Something shifted in him. Not defeat, not relief exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been offered for the first time a second pair of hands. Set up the meeting, he said. Best bet. Nathan found out about it the same evening at dinner. She didn't know how. Perhaps Caleb had told him, or perhaps he'd overheard something through the walls of the house the way people overhear things in a place with thin walls and a lot of people. What she knew was that Nathan pushed back from the table mid-meal, barely half finished, and said with a quiet, cold precision, You're taking her to the bank? Caleb set his fork down. I'm taking us to the bank. She's been here 3 weeks. Nathan, 3 weeks and she's already making decisions about this place. Nathan's voice was controlled, which made it more alarming, not less. That's our land, our problem. You don't even know this woman. The table had gone very still. The twins were staring at their plates. Daniel had gone rigid against the wall. Thomas looked between Nathan and his father with the focused distress of a child watching adults do something he understood was serious, but couldn't entirely interpret. Marcus, the 15-year-old, was the only one watching Evelyn directly, and his expression was complicated, not hostile, but waiting. I know enough, Caleb said. You know she can bake a pie, Nathan said. You don't know if she can be trusted with... Nathan! Caleb's voice changed register, dropped lower. That's enough. Nathan stood up from the table. He hadn't looked at Evelyn once, which she understood was the point. That refusing to look at her was a specific kind of statement. I've been working this ranch since I was 15, he said. 3 years I've kept this place from falling apart while you... He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not anger, or not only anger. Something older and more complicated that he'd pulled back from the edge of saying. He picked up his hat from the peg by the door. I'll finish the north fence tonight, he said, and walked out. The door didn't slam. That was almost worse. Caleb didn't move for a moment. Then he picked up his fork and went back to his food. The younger boys slowly followed. Conversation, thin and careful, resumed. Evelyn ate her meal and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say in that room in that moment. Nathan wasn't wrong about most of it. He'd been carrying this place. He had been, for 3 years, working with hands too young for the job, and a father who'd gone somewhere else behind his own eyes. And he'd done it without asking for credit or relief, which meant the resentment had nowhere to go except in, and then eventually sideways, at the nearest available target. She wasn't the problem. She was just the place the problem had finally found to land. After dinner, she washed the dishes alone. Marcus came in while she was drying the last of the pots and leaned in the doorway, not speaking, until she looked over at him. He's not a bad person, Marcus said. Nathan. I know that, she said. He's just... Marcus searched for it. He doesn't know what to do when someone tries to help. He never learned how. She hung the pot on its hook. Did you? Marcus considered it with the seriousness of a 15-year-old who was still figuring out what he thought about most things. I think I'm learning, he said. She handed him the dish rag. Then you're ahead of most people, she said. He almost smiled. He hung the rag on the hook and drifted back out, and she stood in the quiet kitchen and listened to the ranch settle in the dark, the way she did every night now. And she thought about what Marcus had said. He doesn't know what to do when someone tries to help. She understood that better than she wanted to admit. She'd spent 20 years being useful to people who never quite noticed. She knew what it felt like to stop expecting help and to start armoring yourself against the assumption that it wasn't coming. Once you did that long enough, being offered help didn't feel like relief. It felt like an implication. The question was whether Nathan had enough room left, under the armor, under the years of it, to let anything through. She didn't know the answer. She suspected she wouldn't know for a long time. The bank meeting was the following Thursday. Evelyn wore her blue jacket and brought the ledger and the plan she'd written out in clean columns on 3 pages of paper. The bank officer was a man named Greer, perhaps 55, with the permanent expression of someone who had spent decades delivering bad news in a professional tone. He took Caleb's hand, said the standard things, and then glanced at Evelyn with a kind of careful neutrality that told her he'd already formed a category for her and was waiting to see if she'd confirm it. She laid the papers on his desk without waiting to be invited to. "I've broken the Dawson account into 3 sections," she said. "Where we are, where we can be by October, and what the bank's continued loan would make possible versus what early termination would cost both parties." Greer looked at the papers, then at her, then at Caleb. "This is Mrs. Dawson?" he said to Caleb. "This is Miss Hart," Caleb said. "She manages our accounts." Greer picked up the first page. He read it. He turned to the second page and read that too. His expression didn't change much, but she saw his posture adjust in the small way that people's posture adjusts when they start taking something seriously that they'd come in prepared to dismiss. "The garden projections," he said, "pie sales and market produce. It's supplemental," she said, "not our primary argument. The primary argument is here." She turned to the third page and pointed to the fall cattle numbers. "A modest herd increase before September, and a feed cost reduction I've already negotiated with the Decker's Mill Co-op." She had done this the week before, quietly, over a telephone in the post office, because the current feed suppliers' rates were higher than the co-op's by 11%, and she'd confirmed the co-op would accept a new account. "We don't need to be profitable by October. We need to demonstrate a credible path to it. That's what these numbers do." Greer set the page down and looked at her for a moment. "You have a background in finance, Miss Hart?" "Accounting," she said. 20 years. He looked at Caleb. "I'll need 2 weeks to review this with the lending committee," he said. "But I'll be honest with you. This is a better presentation than I expected from this account." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was the thing one step below a compliment, which was the acknowledgement that he'd expected less. Evelyn took it for what it was. On the drive back to the ranch, Caleb was quiet for the first 5 miles. Then he said, without looking at her, "Where did you learn to talk to a banker like that?" "I've been in a lot of budget meetings," she said. He was quiet another mile. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he'd said it directly to her, about something specific. She looked out the window at the Texas spring coming in brown and green across the flat land, and she thought about how much it shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But it did. She found Nathan at the north fence the following Saturday, right where he'd said he'd be, working with a post-hole digger in the rising heat, with his shirt darkening at the back, every motion efficient and without waste, the kind of work that had become so habitual it barely required thought anymore. She didn't bring him anything. No lemonade, no offer of lunch, nothing that would read as performance. She just walked out there and stood near the fence line until he looked up. He didn't speak. "I need your help," she said. He drove the digger into the ground again. "I'm working." "I know. I'll be quick." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just against the wind. "The garden's going to need irrigation. I don't know this land's water table, and I don't know where the old lines run. You do." He stopped digging. He looked at her for the first time in what felt like days. Really looked at her, with something other than that practiced refusal. He was trying, she thought, to find the angle on this. The manipulation, or the pity, or whatever it was he expected from her. She just waited. "There's a buried line running from the east pump," he said finally. "South side of the barn, runs about 40 yards. My mother put it in when she first planted that garden." He said the last part without softening it, which she respected. "How deep?" "Maybe 18 inches. It should still be intact." "Can you show me where it comes up?" He looked at the fence, then at her. She watched him weigh it. Some people, when they're deciding whether to help you, look for reasons not to. Habit, mostly, the reflex of someone who's been disappointed enough times to treat generosity as a risk. She'd watched Nathan do this from the start. She couldn't tell yet which way he'd land. "Tomorrow morning," he said. Before 6. I'll be there, she said. She turned and walked back toward the house, and she didn't look back because looking back would have ruined it, the small, brittle thing he'd just offered. And she'd learned long ago that small, brittle things needed to be handled without too much attention drawn to them, or they'd crack under the weight of what you hoped they meant. April turned into May, and May began doing what May does in Texas, bearing down with a heat that arrived earlier each morning and stayed later each evening until the days felt long and dense and alive with the smell of dry grass and cattle and working earth. The garden was coming in. Not dramatically. There were sections that had failed, 2 rows of early beans that never made it past the seed stage, a stretch of squash that something had gotten to in the night, but enough. The tomato seedlings she'd started in tin cans on the kitchen windowsill were transplanted and had taken hold. The garlic was up. The kitchen herbs were in pots on the porch, which Thomas now considered his personal responsibility and watered with a slightly uneven commitment that she monitored with one eye. The second Saturday at the market, she sold 5 pies. The third Saturday, 7. Marge Fielding placed her standing order of 2 molasses pecan and began, very gradually, introducing Evelyn to other women at the market with the proprietary air of someone managing a discovery. "This is the woman I told you about," Marge would say, and the other women would look at Evelyn with that same measuring attention, and Evelyn would shake hands and say she was glad to meet them and offer a sample and not explain herself any more than that, because she had learned early in her professional life that the best thing you could do when people were determining what category to put you in was to give them a clear answer before they invented a worse one. By the middle of May, she was getting orders in advance. By the end of it, she had more orders than pies. She needed to scale. She started asking questions about the old wood stove in the barn outbuilding, about flour prices in bulk at the co-op, about whether there was a second oven anywhere on the property. Daniel, the 13-year-old who had barely spoken a word to her since her arrival, came to find her one afternoon while she was measuring the barn outbuilding and said, in his careful, economical way, "There's an oven in the root cellar that my mother never used. She ordered it and it came wrong and she said she'd deal with it later." Evelyn looked at him. "Show me," she said. He showed her. The oven was old and it had a cracked door seal, and it listed slightly to the right, and it was absolutely usable. She looked at it for a long moment, standing in the cool dim of the root cellar with Daniel beside her. "Can you help me figure out how to get it upstairs?" she asked. "It's heavy," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to lift it. I'm asking you to help me figure out how." He thought about it with the serious, methodical turn of mind that she was starting to understand was just how Daniel thought about most things. Careful and thorough and slower than people expected of a boy his age. "I could ask Pete," he finally said, "and Nathan. It'd need at least 3 people." "Would you ask them?" He considered her, then the oven, then her again. "Okay," he said. She turned to walk back up the cellar stairs, and behind her she heard Daniel say, quiet and almost to himself, "It was just sitting there. It shouldn't just sit there." She thought that might be the most he'd said to her at one time since she'd arrived. The oven came upstairs the following Saturday afternoon, carried by Pete and Nathan and Marcus, in a process that involved a great deal of repositioning, 2 boards for leverage, 1 argument about the best angle for the stairs, and Thomas providing enthusiastic verbal commentary from a safe distance. Evelyn stayed out of it, except to open doors and hold things steady when asked. When it was finally in the kitchen, settled next to the existing stove, Nathan straightened up and pressed his hand into his lower back with a wince that he would never have made if he'd noticed her watching. He looked at the oven. Then he looked at her. "You're going to need a different flue connection," he said. "The draw's wrong for this setup. Can it be fixed?" He studied the stovepipe arrangement with the eye of someone who'd been solving mechanical problems out of necessity since he was 15. "Yeah," he said, not happily, but not reluctantly either. Just factually, the way he said most things. "I can fix it." He fixed it that Sunday. He didn't tell her he was going to, and she didn't ask him about it. She just walked into the kitchen Monday morning and found the connection properly routed and the oven holding heat the way it was supposed to, and she stood there a moment and understood that this was how Nathan Dawson communicated. Not with words, not with gestures she could read easily, but with work. She built the first double batch of pies that day. 8 pies. The kitchen smelled like warm sugar and pastry for the first time since she'd arrived, and Thomas appeared at 11 in the morning and asked very seriously if testing was required, and she cut him a small wedge of the first one out of the oven and watched him eat it with complete concentration. "Good," he said in the tone of someone rendering an official judgment. "Thank you," she said. "I'll carry on then." He hopped off the stool and ran back outside, and Evelyn turned to the second batch and realized, with a small, uncomplicated surprise, that she was humming. Not performing it, just doing it. The way you do things you don't notice yourself doing because you're somewhere you've stopped fighting. It wasn't home yet. She wasn't sure what it was yet, but it was something. And something, she had decided at 42 with 2 suitcases and an empty ledger, was worth staying for. June came in hot and stayed that way. The kind of heat that didn't announce itself politely, but simply arrived one morning and took up residence, pressing down on the ranch from first light until well after dark, when the air finally thinned enough to breathe without effort. The cattle moved slower. The boys moved slower. Even the arguments in the house seemed to happen at a lower temperature than before, not because things had gotten easier, but because everyone was conserving energy. Evelyn had learned the rhythms of the place by now. Who needed what, when, and how much of it. Thomas required a specific kind of attention in the mornings, something gentle and unhurried, because he woke up disoriented in a way that reminded her of a compass that needed a moment to find north. The twins, whose names were Sam and Eli, operated as a unit in most things and needed to be addressed together or not at all, or one of them would spend the rest of the day nursing a suspicion that the other had been treated preferentially. Daniel worked best when left alone and checked on, not hovered over. He'd shut down if he felt watched, open up if he felt trusted. Marcus was increasingly easy. He'd passed through whatever internal door he'd been standing at for the first month and had come out the other side as something close to an ally, helping her in the kitchen sometimes, asking questions that showed he was paying attention to what she was doing and why. And Nathan was Nathan. A problem she had stopped trying to solve and started simply working around, the way you work around a creek when there's no bridge. You don't fight it. You find where it's shallow enough to cross, and you cross there, and you don't make a ceremony of it. The irrigation line had been a start, not a breakthrough. She wasn't naive enough to call it that, but a start. He'd helped her locate the buried line, had shown her without excessive commentary where it connected to the east pump, and had said 3 words when she thanked him. Don't flood it. She'd taken that as the specific kind of advice it was and had watered accordingly. The garden was producing now in earnest. Tomatoes coming in heavy and red, beans climbing the poles Thomas had helped her stake, squash sprawling in the way squash always sprawled, without regard for the space it was supposed to stay in. The kitchen herbs were so established on the porch that Pete had nearly knocked them over twice coming up the steps, and had started going around the railing instead. She sold produce at the market alongside the pies now, and Marge Fielding had, in her blunt and proprietorial way, become something like Evelyn's unofficial introducer to every person in Decker's Mill who might possibly want something she was selling. The pie business was real now, not a supplemental thought on a ledger page, actual recurring orders, actual income she could project and plan around. She kept separate accounts for it, clean and organized in the new section of her ledger she'd labeled in her plainest handwriting, bakery. It wasn't enough to save the ranch on its own. She had never pretended it would be, but it was real money coming in reliably each week, and in a household that had been surviving on unreliable money and crossed fingers for 3 years, reliable carried a particular weight. The bank had responded. Greer's letter arrived in the 3rd week of May, formal in its language but positive in its substance. The lending committee had agreed to defer the early termination review pending the October renewal, provided the account showed consistent progress. It was not a celebration. It was a stay of execution, and she treated it as exactly that. She pinned it inside the account ledger where she could see it every time she opened the front cover, and she continued working. Caleb had thanked her again when she showed him the letter. He was getting better at that, at saying the thing briefly, without burying it in other words. She'd noticed that about him, the way he'd started being more direct with her over those weeks, less like he was managing an arrangement, and more like he was talking to a person he'd decided to trust with certain things. It wasn't warmth, exactly. It was something quieter than warmth, but it was consistent, and consistency was something she'd learned to value over most other qualities. What she hadn't expected was how much she'd started relying on it. The trouble with June, beyond the heat, was that it stretched the boys in ways that April and May hadn't. School was out. The younger boys were underfoot in a way that filled the house with a particular kind of noise. Not bad noise, just constant, the way water in a stream is constant, and you stop hearing it until it stops, and the silence is louder. Thomas had decided that the garden was his domain, and spent long hours in it doing a mixture of actual tending and elaborate invented games that only he fully understood. Sam and Eli had taken to building something in the far corner of the barn, the nature of which they refused to disclose to anyone, which Evelyn had decided to interpret as healthy until proven otherwise. Daniel was the one who worried her. He was 13, and he was quiet in a way that wasn't entirely natural. The quiet of someone who had gotten used to not taking up space and had stopped noticing they were doing it. He helped when asked. He worked hard. He never complained and never caused trouble and never, as far as she could tell, asked for anything he needed, which meant he was probably not getting several things he needed. She started leaving books on the kitchen table. Not for him specifically, or not in a way she announced. She'd pick something up from the lending shelf at the post office in Decker's Mill and leave it where the morning light hit it, and anyone passing through might see it. The third book she left this way was a thick, worn paperback about a boy surviving in the wilderness alone. Something that had been read hard enough that the spine had cracked in 2 places. She went to bed that night and came down the next morning to find the book not on the table, but gone. She found it 3 days later under a corner of Daniel's mattress when she was changing the sheets. It was her job. She'd taken it on without asking because nobody had been doing it, and she refused to let boys sleep on unwashed sheets. She put the book back where she found it and made up the bed around it and didn't say anything. 2 weeks later, Daniel came into the kitchen while she was working the accounts and set the book on the table beside her without a word. She looked at it, then at him. "Good?" she asked. "Better than I expected," he said. "There are 2 more by the same author on the post office shelf." He thought about that. "I don't have money for them." "The lending shelf is free," she said. "That's what it's for." He picked the book up. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, which she was learning meant he was working up to something. "Why do you leave them on the table?" he asked. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "In case anyone wants something to read. Nobody else has taken any of them." "No," she agreed. He stood there another moment. Then, "Thank you." Quiet and slightly uncomfortable, like he hadn't said the words enough times in his life for them to feel natural yet. "Any time," she said, and meant it. It was Marcus who told her about Nathan and the letter. She didn't go looking for it. She was in the barn on a Thursday afternoon in mid-June, checking on the feed inventory she'd been trying to stretch between co-op deliveries, when Marcus came in through the side door with the look of someone carrying something they'd been deciding whether to set down. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "You can tell me anything," she said. "I won't do anything with it unless you want me to." He seemed to accept that. He leaned against the stall post. "Nathan got a letter 2 weeks ago, from a rancher in Lubbock. His name's—" He stopped, seemed to decide the name didn't matter. "He's looking for an experienced hand, full-time, with room and board. Nathan hasn't said anything to Papa about it." Evelyn set down the feed count she was making notes on. "How do you know about the letter?" "He left it on his desk. I wasn't reading his things, I just saw it." Marcus looked at the ground, then back up. "He's been working this place since he was 15. Papa never offered him wages, not real ones, just room and board and the understanding that it was his family." She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "He wouldn't leave," Marcus added quickly. "He wouldn't do that to the boys, but I think—" He stopped again. "I think he's thinking about what it would be like to have a choice." She understood that very well. "You're telling me because you're worried," she said. "I'm telling you because I don't know what to do with it," Marcus said honestly, which was the kind of thing a 15-year-old said when he was being braver than most adults. "And I thought maybe you might." She thought about Nathan's hands at the fence, about the way he'd fixed the stovepipe without telling anyone, about what Thomas had said in the garden that first week. He's the one who had to do everything. About the way Nathan never sat at the table long enough to eat a full meal, never asked for anything, never stopped long enough for anyone to ask if he was all right. I'm not sure I do know what to do with it, she said honestly. But thank you for telling me. Marcus nodded, pushed off the post, and went back out into the heat. She stood in the barn for a few minutes after he left, listening to the cattle move in the adjoining pasture. A boy of 18 who had been doing a man's work since 15, with no wages, no credit, and no acknowledgement, and a father who had gone so far inward after losing his wife that he'd taken the boy's sacrifice as simply the way things were. She needed to talk to Caleb. She had been not talking to Caleb about Nathan for 2 months because it wasn't her business, because she hadn't earned the right, because family systems this old and this wound together took time to understand before you put your hands in them. But this was no longer something she could leave in a drawer. She found him after supper on the porch in the last of the light, the way he was most evenings. Not exactly at rest, because Caleb Dawson was not a man who rested, but in the particular stillness of someone whose body had stopped, but whose mind hadn't. She pulled the other chair around and sat down. He looked at her. Something's on your mind. Nathan, she said. He went still in a different way. I'm not going to tell you what to do, she said. I just want to say one thing. He waited. He's been running this ranch as though it were his responsibility for 3 years, without anyone acknowledging that it wasn't supposed to be. She kept her voice even. He's 18. He should be figuring out who he is and what he wants. Instead, he's been keeping this place alive on your behalf. And I don't think you've ever said that to him. Not directly. Not with those words. Caleb's jaw had gone tight. She could see it in the last of the daylight. I know you're aware of it, she said. I'm not saying you're not. I'm saying he doesn't know you're aware of it. And that's different. A long silence. He'd tell me to mind my own business, Caleb said. Probably, she agreed. He's stubborn. He learned it somewhere. Caleb looked out at the darkening pasture. She didn't push further. She'd said the thing. What he did with it was his. She got up to go inside. He said without turning, When I lost Ruth, He stopped, started again. I know I left him with too much. I know that. I just didn't... Another stop. I didn't know how to come back from it and also look him in the eye. She stood in the doorway. I know, she said gently, but I think the longer you wait, the harder that becomes. She went inside and left him with it. The storm came in the second week of July. It announced itself the way bad weather in Texas sometimes did. Not gradually, but all at once, the sky turning a particular shade of greenish-yellow in the late afternoon that made every animal on the property uneasy. The cattle were already moving wrong by 5 o'clock, pressing toward the north fence, which was both instinct and a problem, because the north fence had a section that Nathan had flagged for repair and that hadn't been gotten to yet. Evelyn saw the sky and went to find Caleb. He was already coming out of the barn. He looked up, read the same thing she'd read, and said, Nathan, like it was the beginning of a sentence he didn't finish, because Nathan was already crossing the yard from the equipment shed with his hat pulled down and his stride lengthened to something close to a run. North fence, Nathan said. I know, Caleb said. How many head are near it? Maybe 30? Maybe more by the time we get out there. Pete's at the south pasture. I'll get him. Take Marcus. Nathan was already moving. He looked over his shoulder once, not at Caleb, but at Evelyn, and it was the kind of look she was beginning to understand. Assessing, not hostile. She answered it by turning toward the house. Boys, she called. She had everyone inside within 10 minutes. Thomas. She put in the kitchen with a task. She handed him the job of filling every large pot and container with water from the pump before the storm got bad, and she made it sound important because it was important, not because she was managing him, and he understood the difference and took it seriously. The twins she sent to the root cellar to bring up the storm lanterns they'd located 2 weeks ago for exactly this possibility. Daniel she asked to close and latch every shutter on the lower floor. She went upstairs and did the upper floor herself, moving fast through each room, and when she reached Nathan's room at the end of the hall, she opened the window to pull the shutter in, and the wind hit her face like a wall. Warm and electric and full of something that smelled like rain, still a long way off, but coming hard. She got the shutter latched and went back downstairs. Outside, the light had gone the color of a bruise. She could hear the cattle now. Not the usual low sounds of the herd, but something more urgent, a collective unease that carried across the distance like something wrong in a chord. She stood on the porch and watched the dark line of the storm building to the northwest, the kind of dark that moved. She went back inside and started heating water on the stove. Whatever happened out there tonight, people were going to come back cold and soaked and needing something, and she was going to have it ready. The rain hit at 9, not gently, there was no progression. Dry, then the first drops, then rain. It was dry, and then it was a wall of water and wind that hit the house like a body blow and didn't stop. The lanterns lit the kitchen in amber, and Evelyn sat with the 4 younger boys and listened to the storm work on the house, the moaning in the eaves, the clatter of something she'd missed in the yard, the percussion of rain against the window glass. Thomas had climbed into her side without making a decision about it, the way small children sometimes did, simply sidling until they were beside you and then staying there, and she put her arm around him because that was the obvious thing to do, and it didn't require analysis. "Are they okay?" Sam asked. He meant his father and Nathan and Marcus. "They're working," she said. "Your father has been through 100 storms." "Not like this one," Eli said. "Like some of them," she said, because honesty was usually better than reassurance when children were smart enough to see through reassurance. An hour in, she put on Caleb's spare rain slicker from the peg by the door and told Daniel to watch the younger ones, and she went out. The rain hit her like a cold fist even through the slicker. She couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. She followed the fence line from memory. She'd walked it enough times now to have it in her body, moving north toward the sound of the cattle, which she could hear through the rain as a kind of muffled panic, the herd pressing and moving in the dark. She found Marcus first near the fence break, holding a rope attached to something she couldn't immediately see in the dark. "Miss Hart," he started. "Where's the break?" He pointed left. She could see it now, a 20-foot section of fence that had come down, posts and all, under the weight of water and possibly a tree branch that lay across the wire. On the other side, cattle were moving, the nearest ones already through the gap. "How many out?" she shouted over the rain. "Maybe a dozen." She moved along the fence toward the sound of Caleb's voice. He was in the dark beyond the break. She could hear him working, and Nathan was somewhere to his left driving cattle back toward the gap from the wrong side, which was the necessary thing but also the dangerous one because he was on foot in the dark with a panicked herd. "Caleb," she shouted. "Here!" He materialized out of the rain 10 feet from her. He was soaked through, his face streaming, but his voice was steady. "We've got most of them. Nathan's—" "I see him," she said, because she could. A moving shape in the dark, moving with the cattle and not against them, the right technique, and she felt something release in her chest. "I need rope," Caleb said. "Marcus has it." She went back to Marcus and took one end of the rope and brought it to Caleb, and they rigged a temporary barrier across the gap. Not a fix, not anything that would hold past tomorrow, but enough to direct the cattle back in the right direction while Nathan worked them from the other side. It took an hour, maybe more. She lost track of time in the rain. She was soaked through the slicker by 30 minutes in, and her boots were taking on water. And at some point she slipped in the mud and went down on one knee and came up with mud down her front and kept going because there wasn't a reason not to. When the last of the cattle were back inside the fence and the rope was holding the gap, and everyone had stopped moving for long enough to breathe, Nathan came around the end of the fence line and stopped when he saw her. She was standing in the rain, mud on her jacket, her hair plastered flat, holding the rope end that Caleb had asked her to hold. She must have looked, she thought later, like a specific kind of disaster. Nathan stood there in the rain and looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his face in the dark and the rain. Then he came and took the rope from her without a word and tied it off on the post himself. And when he turned back, she thought she saw something in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not warmth, Nathan didn't move that fast, but the absence of something that had been there before. The refusal. The wall. He said nothing. He went to stand beside his father, and they began talking about the fence repair in low voices, and she stood back and let them, and she thought, all right, something just moved. They came back to the house past midnight, all of them. Caleb, Nathan, Marcus, Pete, who had come from the south pasture once the worst of it passed. Evelyn had the hot water ready, and dry towels stacked by the back door, and a pot of the thickest soup she could make from what was available, and the stove burning high and warm against the chill the rain had brought. Nobody said much. They came in. changed, sat down. She served the soup. Thomas was asleep on the kitchen bench, had fallen asleep there, and she'd left him because moving him felt cruel. And he slept through the whole of it. Marcus ate 2 full bowls without looking up. Pete said, "Good soup, ma'am," with the conservative sincerity of a man who saved his words for when he meant them. Caleb sat at the table after he'd eaten and just existed there for a while, too tired to move, and she refilled his coffee twice without being asked. Nathan finished eating and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the particular blankness of someone who had used everything they had and was running on empty now. Then he looked at her. "You didn't have to come out there," he said. "I know," she said. "You could have stayed in." "I know that too." He was quiet. She could feel him working on something, turning it over with whatever was left of his energy. The table was almost empty now. Marcus had drifted out. Pete had gone back to his quarters. Caleb was half asleep in his chair. "The fence line runs about 200 yards, Nathan said. "You stayed on the right section. In the dark, in the rain, you didn't drift." She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down. "I've walked it enough times," she said. He looked at her in a way that was slightly different from any of the other ways he'd looked at her over the past 3 months. Not friendly? It was too soon for friendly, and they both knew it. But something in the order of, "I see you. I haven't decided what that means yet, but I see you." "The fence needs proper repair," he said, coming back to the practical because that was where Nathan lived. "Tomorrow, before the next rain moves in." "I'll keep the boys out of the way," she said. He nodded. He stood up, pushed his chair in, and said, "Good soup," in the same economical way Pete had, which meant he'd noticed but wasn't going to make a thing of it, and she understood that was the most she'd get, and she took it. He went upstairs. She sat in the quiet kitchen with her coffee, listening to the rain slowing outside and Caleb's breathing beginning to even out towards sleep in his chair. She thought about the fence and the cattle and the mud she'd have to scrub out of the borrowed slicker. She thought about Nathan's face in the rain, and then from upstairs came a sound she hadn't expected. Voices, low, moving towards something. Caleb's chair scraped, and he was suddenly more awake than he'd seemed, his head up, listening. "I should," he started. "Let them talk," she said. He looked at her. "If it's happening," she said, "let it." He settled back. She listened to the voices upstairs. Not the words, just the register of them, the pattern. One voice staying low and careful, one voice with heat in it that gradually, over the course of 10 or 15 minutes, changed its shape. Not to silence, but to something different from what it had been. She didn't know what they said to each other that night. She didn't ask after, and neither of them told her. But she knew, in the particular way you knew things when you'd been watching a family from the outside for long enough, that something had moved that had been stuck for years. Something that needed the right combination of exhaustion and rain and a long night working in the dark together before it could be dislodged. The rain stopped around 2 in the morning. She sat on the porch in the quiet after it, listening to the water drip from the eaves, and she let herself feel, for just a moment, the full weight of the night. Not triumphant, nothing so clean as that. Just tired and present, and glad she'd gone out into the rain. The first light of morning was still hours away. The ranch was quiet. The cattle were settled. The fence would hold until tomorrow. She went inside and went to bed, and she slept without dreaming, deep and uninterrupted, until the world outside started up again. Nobody talked directly about what had happened between Caleb and Nathan that night. That was fine. Evelyn had lived long enough to know that some conversations didn't need to be reported to be real. What mattered was the evidence. The small, observable shifts that told you something had changed underneath, even if the surface was still calm. Nathan started eating full meals at the table again. Not every night, not with any announcement, but consistently enough that she stopped noticing his absence and started noticing his presence, which was its own kind of milestone. He passed dishes without being asked. He answered questions his father directed at him without the half-second delay that had always felt like a door being considered before it was opened. It wasn't a transformation. She was careful not to call it that, even in her own head, because transformations were the kind of thing that existed in stories and then disappointed you when real life didn't hold the shape. It was more like a settling, the way a house settles after a hard season, things shifting into slightly better alignment without anyone being able to point to the exact moment it happened. The fence got repaired the day after the storm, and the day after that. And Caleb worked alongside Nathan for both of those days in a way that looked different from before. Not warmer, exactly. Caleb wasn't a warm man by nature, and she'd stopped expecting him to become one, but more present, more deliberate. Like he was paying attention to the fact of Nathan beside him in a way he hadn't let himself before. She watched this from a careful distance and kept her mouth shut and kept working. August was coming, and August meant the October deadline was no longer abstract. The pie business had outgrown the kitchen. This was a problem that would have seemed absurd to her 4 months ago. The idea that she would have more orders than she could fill, more customers than she could serve, more need than she had capacity for. But August and Decker's Mill brought the county fair, and the county fair brought people from 4 surrounding towns, and Marge Fielding had, without particularly asking, told approximately everyone she knew that there was a woman out at the Dawson place who made the best molasses pecan pie in Harlow County and who took orders if you got to her early enough. The orders had come. Evelyn sat down with her ledger on the first Sunday of August and did the math 3 times to make sure she wasn't misreading it. If she filled every order she had for the fair week and the 2 weeks surrounding it, she would bring in more in 3 weeks than she had in the previous 2 months combined. The numbers were right. She checked them again because good news made her suspicious in a way that bad news never did. Bad news she believed immediately, but good news she always made prove itself. The numbers held. The problem was flour, lard, sugar, time, and oven capacity. She had 2 ovens now, but 2 ovens running simultaneously in an August kitchen in Texas was its own particular challenge, and she couldn't do it alone. She'd been doing most of the baking herself with Thomas as her helper on the simple tasks, but for the volume she needed in the next 3 weeks, she needed another pair of hands that could actually follow a recipe. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she went to find Daniel. He was in the barn, doing something precise and methodical with a section of harness that had been needing repair for weeks. The kind of task that nobody had gotten to because it was careful work that required patience, and Daniel had both. She stood at the barn door long enough for him to look up. "I need to teach you to make pie crust," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not a cook," he said. "You're someone who can follow precise instructions and pay attention to what you're doing," she said. "That's all pie crust requires." He set down the harness. He had the look he always got when he was deciding something. That serious, slow-turning consideration that she'd learned to wait out. "Why me?" he said. "Because you're careful," she said, "and because I think you're bored, and boredom makes careful people go wrong directions." Something shifted in his face, not offense, but recognition, which was worse and better at the same time. He stood up. "All right," he said. She taught him that afternoon. It took longer than it would have taken an adult. Not because Daniel was slow, but because he was thorough, and thoroughness meant he needed to understand not just what to do, but why. And she explained everything because she respected that. By the end of the afternoon, he had made 2 crusts, the first of which was slightly too thick on one side, the second of which was nearly right. "That's better than my first attempt," she told him, and she meant it. He looked at the second crust with the particular expression of someone who was measuring the distance between what they'd done and what was possible. "I could do it better," he said. "Yes," she said. "You will." He helped her every morning for the next week, arriving in the kitchen before 6 without being asked, working with a focused quiet that made the kitchen feel different, more like a place where something was being built. He didn't talk much while he worked, which suited her, because she didn't talk much while she worked either, and the shared silence of 2 people doing careful things in the same room was its own kind of companionship. On the 5th morning, while they were rolling the 3rd batch, he said, without looking up, "Is this going to help?" "The pies." "For the ranch." "Yes," she said. "Not enough alone. But it's real money, and it's consistent, which counts for more than most people think." He kept rolling. "What else are you doing?" "For the ranch." She glanced at him. He was 13, and he was asking a direct, intelligent question, and she decided he deserved a direct, intelligent answer. "Showing the bank that this place can generate income from more than one source," she said. "The cattle business is the core of it. But if the cattle business is the only thing, one bad year can end everything. If there are other income streams, the bakery, the garden produce, eventually something else, then one bad year in one area doesn't take the whole thing down." He was quiet for a moment. That's what happened when Mama died, he said. Papa couldn't do the cattle business and everything else at the same time, so everything else fell apart. Yes, she said. He turned the dough and didn't say anything else for a while. Then she used to bake too. Not pies, mostly. Bread. She made bread every Saturday morning. Evelyn kept her hands on the pastry and her voice even. What kind? White, sometimes with seeds on top. A pause. I forget exactly what it smelled like. That bothers me. She thought about that, about what it meant to be 13 and already afraid that you were losing the sensory details of someone you loved, the smell and the specific texture of memory starting to go soft around the edges. The things that matter most aren't usually the specific details, she said carefully. They're more like a feeling, a sense of being somewhere safe that doesn't go. He was quiet for a long moment. She would have thought this was funny, he said. You teaching me to make pie? It wasn't cruel. He almost smiled when he said it. Probably, Evelyn said. Most sensible women find 13-year-old boys trying to make pie crust pretty funny. And Daniel actually laughed. A short, real laugh, the first she'd heard from him, and went back to his dough. The county fair ran for 4 days in the middle of August. Evelyn had never worked that hard in her life, and she had worked very hard for a very long time, so this was not a casual statement. She and Daniel baked for 3 days before the fair opened, filling the root cellar with finished pies wrapped in cloth and packed in boxes she'd gotten from the mercantile. Thomas carried boxes. Marcus drove the wagon. Sam and Eli argued about who got to sit in the front for the drive into Decker's Mill until she assigned them both to the back, and that settled it. She had a proper table now. Caleb had built it, without being asked, from spare timber in the barn, a solid plank table with legs that didn't wobble. And Daniel helped her set it up each morning and break it down each evening. He had turned out to be a natural at the sales side of things in a way she hadn't expected, serious, precise, and completely immune to being talked down on price, which was a quality she deeply respected. On the second day of the fair, a woman came to the table twice. The first time she bought a pie without saying much. The second time she came back and stood looking at the remaining pies with a different kind of attention. Not a customer's attention, but something more calculating. Her name was Mrs. Hartley, she said. She ran the dry goods store in Cedar Fork, the next town over, about 12 miles from Decker's Mill. Do you supply to shops? She asked. Evelyn looked at her. I haven't, she said. I've been selling direct. I could move 4 pies a week, Mrs. Hartley said. Possibly 6 if the molasses pecan sells the way I think it will. Fixed price, weekly delivery, I handle the retail. Evelyn did the math in her head while keeping her expression politely neutral. What margin are you taking? Mrs. Hartley named a number. It was reasonable, not generous, but reasonable, which was all she needed it to be. I'll need a week to look at the supply side, Evelyn said. I can give you an answer by next Friday. Mrs. Hartley looked faintly surprised. She'd probably expected either an immediate yes or an immediate negotiation. The idea that Evelyn would need a week to think it over seemed to reframe the conversation in a way the woman hadn't anticipated. All right, she said. Friday. Daniel waited until Mrs. Hartley was out of earshot and then said quietly, That was smart, making her wait. I wasn't making her wait strategically, Evelyn said. I genuinely need to check the numbers. Oh, he said, then, but it still worked. Sometimes the honest thing and the smart thing are the same thing, she said. She brought the Cedar Fork proposal to Caleb that evening. She laid out the numbers, the supply cost, the delivery logistics, the margin, what it would mean for the monthly income picture. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical and specific, which was how she'd learned Caleb engaged with things he was taking seriously. Then he said, You need a horse and buggy that's reliable for 12 miles. Pete's rig would do it. Pete needs his rig. She'd anticipated this. I looked at the listings in the Decker's Mill paper. There's a second-hand buggy at the livery on Marsh Street for $38. It's old, but Pete looked at it last month for something else and said it was sound. Caleb looked at her with that measuring expression she'd gotten used to. You already talked to Pete about it. I wanted to know if it was worth bringing to you, she said. He was quiet for a moment. What does the Cedar Fork contract do to the October numbers? She turned to the page in her ledger where she'd already run it. She slid it across the table. He looked at it for a long time. His expression didn't change, but she had learned to read the small signs, the slight easing around his eyes, the way his shoulders settled a fraction. "Buy the buggy," he said. She took the ledger back. "I'll go tomorrow morning." He stood up from the table and then didn't immediately leave, which was unusual. He stood there with his hand on the back of the chair, and she waited because she'd learned that Caleb's silences were often the beginning of something. "I went to see Ruth's grave last week," he said. He didn't look at her. "First time since spring." She said nothing. "I'd been avoiding it." He turned the chair slightly under his hand. "I don't know why I'm telling you this." "You don't need a reason," she said. He nodded slowly. "I talked to Nathan," he said. "The night of the storm. I said things I should have said 2 years ago." A pause. "He said things too. I didn't like all of it." "That's usually how it goes," she said. "He said he felt invisible." Caleb's voice was careful and low. "That's the word he used. That he'd been working this ranch for 3 years and it felt like I looked through him instead of at him." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what to say to that." "What did you say?" "I said he was right." He looked at the table. "I said I was sorry. And I told him that the work he'd done, 3 years of it, was the only reason this place still existed. That I knew that I should have said it years ago." Evelyn kept very still. "He didn't say much back," Caleb said. "Nathan never does, but he stopped. He didn't leave. He just sat there for a while, and then we talked about the fence, like normal." A pause. "Maybe that's enough for now." "I think that might be exactly enough for now," she said. He looked at her then, directly, in the lamplight. He had a particular way of looking at her lately. Not the assessing, cautious look of the early months, but something with more weight to it, something she had been careful not to examine too closely, because examining it felt like a risk she hadn't decided she was ready for. "You've been good for this family," he said. It came out plainly, without ornament, which was the only way Caleb said things that mattered. She looked back at him steadily. "I've been good for this ranch," she said. "The family part is still working itself out." Something almost like a smile crossed his face. It lasted about 1 second. "That's honest," he said. "It's what you said you needed," she said. "Someone sensible." He picked up his hat from the peg. "Good night, Evelyn," he said. Her first name, which he'd been using for a month now, but which still had a slightly different weight when he said it at the end of a conversation like this one. "Good night," she said. She sat at the table after he left and listened to his boots on the stairs, and then silence. And she sat with the ledger open in front of her without looking at it. And she thought about the word enough and what it cost a man like Caleb Dawson to say it, and what it would cost her to let it mean what she suspected it was starting to mean. The letter from the bank arrived on a Tuesday in early September. She was in the kitchen when the post came. Thomas brought it in with the particular importance he attached to the mail-carrying task, which he had assigned to him specifically because he needed things to be responsible for. He put the stack on the table and pointed at the envelope on top. "That one's from the bank," he said. "I can tell because it has the stamp." "Thank you," she said, and waited until he went back outside before she picked it up. She read it standing at the table. Then she read it again. The lending committee had completed its preliminary review of the Dawson account. Based on demonstrated revenue improvement, diversified income sources, and a credible projection plan for Q4, the committee had voted to proceed with standard renewal terms in October, rather than initiating early termination. The account would be reviewed at renewal in the normal course. No further extraordinary measures were required at this time. She set the letter down. She had been in accounting for 20 years, and she had learned, over those 20 years, not to celebrate prematurely. Numbers had a way of changing on you, and situations had a way of being more complicated than the last piece of paper suggested. But this was the bank saying, in their specific legal language, that they were not going to take the ranch. Not this year. Not unless something went significantly wrong between now and October, and she was going to make sure nothing went significantly wrong between now and October. She made coffee. She took it to the porch. She sat down in the morning heat, and she permitted herself, for exactly 5 minutes, to feel something uncomplicated. Not pride. Pride was too simple a word for it. Something closer to relief, but denser than relief. The feeling of having carried a thing a long way and set it down somewhere solid. Nathan found her there. He came around the side of the house from the direction of the barn, stopped when he saw her, and came up the porch steps. He looked at the letter on the table beside her coffee. She pushed it toward him. He read it. He had his father's quality of not reacting visibly to things, processing them somewhere internal and only showing you the result after. He set the letter back down. October renewal, he said. Standard terms. He put his hands in his pockets. He looked out at the pasture for a moment, then at her. When you came here, he said, I thought... He stopped. I thought you were someone my father was bringing in because he couldn't handle things himself, and I thought that meant I'd been handling things for 3 years for nothing. She didn't rush him. I was wrong about what it meant, he said. I don't think I was wrong about what I'd been doing, but I was wrong about why you were here. Why do you think I'm here now? She asked. He thought about it seriously, which she appreciated because a lot of people wouldn't have. Because you needed a place, he said, and we needed someone who could see things clearly, and it worked out that those two things matched up. He paused. That's not a bad reason for something. No, she said. It isn't. He looked at the letter one more time. Is it enough for the bank? It's enough for October, she said. After that, we have to keep building. The Cedar Fork contract helps. A good fall cattle sale helps more. The fall sale... He stopped, started over. I've been looking at the Harlow County auction dates. If we can bring 20 head in the second week of October, the market's usually stronger than August. How many head do we have that are ready? 16? Maybe 18. We need 20. He nodded, working it. There are 2 from the Peterson place that have been running the east border for a month. If we can negotiate purchase, I can have them ready. This was something new, Nathan bringing her a piece of the operational picture, not as a challenge, but as information. She picked up her ledger from beside the letter and opened it to the cattle page. What's Peterson likely to want? Nathan named a number. She wrote it down. They sat on the porch steps in the morning heat and worked through the purchase math together, back and forth, until they had something that was plausible, if not comfortable, and she wrote the final number down and underlined it. I'll need you to do the negotiation with Peterson, she said. He'll take it better from you than from me. I can do that, Nathan said. She looked at him. 18 years old, calloused hands, the serious face of someone who had been carrying responsibilities too large for his age, and who was only now beginning to figure out that the weight had been worth something. You're good at this, she said. The ranch work, not just the labor, the understanding of it. That's not common. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the directness of it, the way people who hadn't heard enough honest compliments always looked, like they were waiting for the qualifier. I grew up here, he said. Lots of people grow up somewhere and don't understand it the way you understand this, she said. She wasn't being generous. She was being accurate, and she thought it was important he understand the difference. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, Marcus is the same way. People don't see it in him because he doesn't push it forward, but he knows this land. I've noticed, she said. He's going to want to stay, Nathan said, after he's older. He's not going to want to leave for school or for something else. He's going to want this. Is that what you want? She asked. To stay? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't think he was going to answer. I don't know yet, he said finally, but I want it. That's different from before. He stood up. I'll go see Peterson today. He went down the porch steps, and she watched him cross the yard toward the barn with that same efficient, purposeful stride he always had. And she thought about what he'd said. I want it. That was an honest thing to say. That was someone being truthful about where they actually were versus where they wished they were. She respected it more than a simpler answer would have given her. September moved through its weeks with the quality of a season beginning to reconsider itself. The mornings cooler, the evenings coming sooner, the light changing to the particular amber of early autumn that made the flat Texas land look, for an hour each evening, like something out of a painting. The Peterson cattle came in. Nathan had negotiated them for slightly under the number she'd written down, which she noted in the ledger with satisfaction, and told him so. The Cedar Fork delivery started. She and Daniel drove the buggy those 12 miles on Wednesday mornings, and she let Daniel handle the transaction with Mrs. Hartley while she watched, because he was learning something she could only teach by stepping back, and he was learning it faster than she'd expected. Mrs. Hartley had, by the third week, moved from 4 pies to 6 and asked about bread. "That's not in the current arrangement," Daniel told her pleasantly, with the particular calm of someone who had been poor negotiator's best material to learn from, which was Evelyn herself. "We can talk about that separately." In the buggy on the way home, Evelyn looked at him. "Bread," Daniel said, watching the road. "Is that something we can do?" "It's something to think about," she said. "Okay." He held the reins with the careful competence of someone who had learned a new thing and was not yet casual with it. "I'm thinking about it." She looked out at the passing land and thought that he sounded, in that moment, like someone who had decided he had a stake in something. The younger boys had changed too, in the accumulation of small ways that change happened in children. Thomas was taller and less anxious in the mornings, and had developed firm opinions about which herbs belonged in which dishes that she found both occasionally incorrect and completely admirable. Sam and Eli had finally revealed the construction project in the barn corner, which turned out to be a remarkably functional chicken coop built from salvaged lumber that they presented to her with the combined pride of two people who have accomplished something real. "Can we get chickens?" Sam asked. "That's a question for your father," she said. "He'll say yes if you ask," Eli said. "Then you should ask him," she said. "It's your chicken coop." They got chickens, 5 of them, from a neighbor 3 miles down the road who had more than she needed. Small and loud and immediate in the way chickens were immediate, requiring specific things at specific times in a way that Thomas took extremely seriously and that the twins treated as their personal small enterprise. Within 2 weeks, there were eggs. Within a month, there were enough eggs that Evelyn added them to the market table and the ledger. And Daniel said eggs in the same tone he'd said bread, and she said, "Yes, I know." Caleb found her in the garden on a Sunday afternoon in late September. She was staking the last of the tomato plants against the early fall wind, something she'd been meaning to do for a week and had kept not getting to, and she heard his boots on the path and didn't turn around because she could identify everyone on this property now by the sound of how they walked. He came and stood beside her and looked at the garden without speaking for a moment. It was genuinely unrecognizable from what it had been in April. The acre of weeds and dead soil now planted and producing and organized with the kind of careful logic that a person who worked with numbers brought to physical space. "I didn't come to talk about the ranch," he said. She finished the stake she was working on and straightened up. He was looking at the garden, not at her, which was how he looked at things he was working up to. "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. "When I put that advertisement in the paper," he said, "I want to be straight with you about what I was doing. I needed someone capable. That was real, but I also—" He stopped, started again. "I think I'd gotten so far inside the practical problem of keeping this family alive that I'd stopped being honest with myself about what I actually needed." She said nothing. "You've been here 6 months," he said, "and you're not—" He stopped a third time, and she understood that Caleb Dawson was a man who could work 14-hour days in driving rain without complaint, but who found honesty about his own feelings about as navigable as rough terrain in the dark. She waited. "You're not what I advertised for," he said finally. "You're more than that. I know that's not—" He made a slight gesture. "I know that's not a clear thing to say." "I understand what you mean," she said. He looked at her then. "Do you?" She held his gaze. "I think so," she said carefully. "But I think you should say it clearly, if you're going to say it." It cost him something. She could see that. Not because he was a coward, but because he was a man who had been economical with himself for 3 years and was being asked to spend something he'd almost forgotten how to spend. He looked at her steadily, this woman standing in the garden she'd grown from a weed field, with dirt on her hands and her hair pulled back practically, and he said, "I'd like you to stay, not because of the ranch, because of me." The garden was quiet around them. A bird moved in the near tree. "Caleb," she said, "I'm 42 years old. I'm not sentimental about this kind of thing." "I know. And you're a man who's still in the middle of grieving your wife, whether you know it or not." "I know that too." "Then why—" "Because I know all of that," he said, "and I still mean what I said." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in the drawer he hadn't wanted to look at, about the way he'd helped load the wagon at 6 in the morning without being asked, about the chair he'd pulled to the other side of the table each Friday evening to go over accounts, about the 2 words he said with difficulty and the 1,000 things he said without words. She was not a romantic. She had never been a romantic. But she was an honest woman, and the honest thing, the thing she owed herself and probably owed him, was to stop pretending she hadn't noticed what had been growing between them in the ordinary work of ordinary days. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her. That same look, the one that had started to carry weight she didn't entirely know what to do with yet. "That's not the same as what I asked," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not, but it's the most I can say honestly right now." He accepted that. She'd learned that about him too. He accepted honest partial answers better than most people, because he understood that forcing the complete answer before it was ready produced something false, and he had enough of the false thing in his life already. He looked back at the garden. "The tomatoes need to come in before the first frost," he said. "I know," she said. "I was planning to start Monday. Nathan can help. I know that too." He nodded, once. He turned and walked back up the path toward the barn, and she watched him go and stood in the late September sun with dirt on her hands and the solid, complicated feeling of a person who has built something real in an unfamiliar place and has just been told plainly that the building was worth something beyond what she'd planned on. She turned back to her staking and finished the row and didn't allow herself to make too much of it. Not yet. She was practical by nature and by long experience, and practicality said one thing at a time. The bank in October. The fall cattle sale. The winter supply. But underneath the practicality, quiet and persistent and increasingly difficult to ignore, something had taken root in the same soil she'd broken open back in April, in the same place where nothing had grown for years. She didn't rush it. She just let it be there. The tomatoes could come in on Monday. She had work to finish today. The tomatoes came in on Monday, the way she'd said they would. All of them, every last one that was worth keeping. Nathan and Thomas and Evelyn working the rows from early morning until the light went flat in the early afternoon, filling baskets that Marcus ferried to the root cellar in steady trips. It was unglamorous work, the kind that left your back aching and your hands stained red-brown and your knees sore from crouching. And nobody complained because complaints didn't fill baskets. Thomas kept a running count in his head and announced the total every 15 minutes with the authority of someone conducting an official census. Nathan corrected his count twice. Thomas disputed the corrections both times. By noon, they had more tomatoes than she'd projected, which was the kind of problem she enjoyed having. She stood at the garden's edge in the afternoon and looked at what remained. The herbs still going strong, the last of the squash, the bare poles where the beans had been, the acre that had been weeds and dry clay in April. She was tired in the specific, honest way of someone who had used their body for something real, and she let herself stand there for a moment and feel it without rushing past it. October was 4 days away. The cattle sale happened on the 12th of October, the second week of the month, the way Nathan had planned it. He and Caleb drove the 20 head to the Harlow County auction, Pete riding alongside to help manage the herd on the road. And Evelyn stayed at the ranch with the boys and spent the day doing accounts and pretending she wasn't watching the lane for dust that would mean they were coming back. She had done her numbers carefully and honestly, the way she always did. The ranch needed a certain floor price per head to make the October renewal picture look right. If they got above it, they were in solid ground. If they came in below, she'd need to rebalance other columns, which was possible but would be tight going into winter. She didn't share any of this with the boys because it wasn't theirs to carry. Daniel came into the kitchen at mid-afternoon, stood at the counter for a moment, and said, "Are you worried?" "I'm calculating," she said. "That's the same thing with you." She looked at him. He was 13 and he'd gotten slightly taller since August, and he looked sometimes startlingly like someone who was going to be a serious and capable adult and was just waiting for time to catch up. "The numbers are close," she said. "It'll depend on the market today." "Nathan knows what he's doing," Daniel said. "I know that. He's been watching those cattle for months, getting them ready." He poured himself a glass of water. "He wanted this sale to go right, not just for the ranch." She waited. "For you," Daniel said, with the directness of a 13-year-old who hadn't yet learned the adult habit of talking around things. Because you put the plan together. He wanted your plan to work. She turned back to her ledger. Go check on your brothers, she said, because if she said anything else, she would say too much. He went. They came back at 5 in the afternoon, all three of them, and she heard the wagon before she saw it and made herself stay at the kitchen table instead of going to the porch. Caleb came through the door first. He set his hat on the peg. He looked at her. He named the price per head. It was above the floor, not dramatically, not the kind of number that changed everything overnight, but solidly, credibly above it, in the range that would make the October ledger look like exactly what she'd told the bank it would look like. She wrote the number down. She didn't shout or make a display of it. She wrote it in the column where it belonged and added it up and set the pen down. Good, she said. Caleb sat down across from her. He had the look of a man who had been waiting all day to put something down and was now putting it down. Nathan got them to hold the bidding open on the last 4, he said. Waited for the right buyer. That's why we're above number. I know, she said. He told me he was going to try that. Caleb looked at her. He told you. Last week. He wanted to know if the margin difference was worth the risk of the delay. She looked at the number on the page. It was. Outside, she could hear Nathan and Pete in the yard, and the younger boys coming out to meet them. Thomas's voice rising above the rest with his urgent need to know everything immediately. She heard Nathan's voice, low and patient, answering. Caleb watched her close the ledger. Is it enough? He asked. For October. Yes, she said. It's enough for October and for a reasonable start to the winter supply. We're not comfortable, but we're not in danger. He sat with that for a moment. A year ago, he said, I didn't think there was a way through it. I know, she said. I'd stopped looking, he said, and there was something in how he said it. Not confession exactly, but the honest admission of a man who had decided that honesty was less costly than he'd thought. I was just keeping the days moving, telling myself that was enough. She understood that. She understood it more than she'd said, because she'd done the same thing for years in Abilene, kept the days moving, kept the accounts balanced, kept herself useful, and told herself that was a life. The difference was that she'd recognized it eventually. Not proudly, not dramatically. She just looked up one day from a cold cup of coffee in a laundromat and realized the shape around her wasn't one she'd chosen, and she'd written a letter to a stranger. It's not always enough, she said. Just keeping the days moving. No, he agreed. It's not. The bank meeting was on October 17th. She and Caleb drove to Decker's mill together, which was different from the first time. Different in the way that a thing is different when you've done it once as strangers and again as something else that doesn't yet have a clean name. Greer met them in the same office, with the same professional neutrality, and she laid the same kind of organized papers on his desk. The numbers were better than what she'd projected in the spring. Not radically. She hadn't performed miracles, and she didn't believe in presenting numbers that leaned optimistic, but genuinely, solidly better. The cattle sale, the bakery income, now including the Cedar Fork contract, the garden produce, the egg revenue that Sam and Eli tracked with fierce personal investment in their chicken ledger, which was a small notebook they'd started keeping themselves that she'd found and read with something close to joy. Greer looked at the papers. He took longer this time. That was a good sign. When a banker took longer, it meant he was reading rather than confirming what he'd already decided. The bakery operation, he said. That's a formal ongoing contract with the Cedar Fork store? Written and signed, she said. She had the copy in the folder. He looked at it. He looked at the cattle numbers. He set everything down and looked at Caleb. You've turned this account around significantly in 6 months, he said. I'll be direct with you. When I sent that preliminary letter in March, I expected to be closing this account in October. Caleb said nothing. He had a quality, when things were going the way he'd hoped, of becoming very still, as though stillness was the only way he knew to hold something without dropping it. Standard renewal terms, Greer said. 3-year fixed at existing rate. The account is in good standing. He slid the papers across. Caleb signed. Evelyn witnessed. Greer shook both their hands with the practiced warmth of a man returning to goodwill after a near miss, and they walked out into the October morning with the signed papers in the folder under her arm and the particular lightness of 2 people who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. They stood on the sidewalk outside the bank. Caleb looked at the street for a moment. 3-year fixed, he said. It's good terms, she said. It means we have 3 years to make this thing sustainable, not just surviving. Yes, she said. That's exactly what it means. He looked at her. The October light was doing something specific to the street, that clean fall light that made everything look more itself. And he was looking at her with the same particular directness he'd had in the garden 3 weeks ago, the one she'd told herself not to examine too closely. She looked back at him and stopped telling herself that. I meant what I said, he told her. In the garden. I know you did, she said. And? She held the folder with the signed papers. She thought about the 11-line advertisement and the letter she'd written honestly to a stranger. She thought about the first morning she'd stood on the porch with 2 suitcases and the look on Nathan's face and the specific cold weight of walking into a room where nobody had asked for you. She thought about everything that had happened between that morning and this one, and the slow, unglamorous, real nature of all of it. I'm not going to pretend this is simple, she said. You've got 6 sons and a ranch and 3 years of hard work ahead. And I'm a woman who showed up with a blank ledger and learned your fence lines from memory. I know all of that, he said, and I'm still not sentimental about it. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment longer. But I meant what I said as well, she said. I'm not going anywhere. He understood this time what she meant by it. He didn't make a ceremony of it. He wasn't a man who made ceremonies. He just nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled, and she felt something settle in herself at the same time. Not a dramatic falling into place, nothing so neat as that, but the quiet completion of a decision she'd been working toward since April without fully admitting she was making it. They walked back to the wagon together and drove home, and the road between Decker's Mill and Dawson Ranch was 9 miles of flat Texas land that she now knew the way she knew her own hands. Nathan was waiting at the gate when they pulled in. Not obviously waiting. He was working on the gate latch, which had been sticking for a week, something he could have done any morning. But he was there when they arrived, and he straightened up when the wagon came down the lane, and he looked at them both with that reading look of his. Well, he said. 3-year renewal, Caleb said. Standard terms. Nathan looked at the latch in his hand. He worked his jaw once, the way he did when something cost him more to feel than he wanted it to. Good, he said. Caleb stepped down from the wagon. He stopped beside Nathan. There was a moment between them that Evelyn didn't look away from. She thought it deserved a witness. The two of them standing at the gate they'd both spent years keeping, father and son, both of them damaged by the same loss in different ways, both of them standing on the other side of a night in July when something had finally been said that needed saying. Good work on the sale, Caleb said. The price on those last 4. That was the right call. Nathan kept his eyes on the latch for a second. Then he looked up at his father. I knew the buyer, he said. I'd talked to him twice at the feed store. I knew he'd go higher if we waited. I didn't know you knew him, Caleb said. You didn't ask, Nathan said. It wasn't a reproach anymore, just a fact. No, Caleb said. I'll do better at asking. Nathan looked at him for a moment. Then he went back to the latch. It's fixed now, he said, swinging the gate. Shouldn't stick anymore. Caleb put his hand briefly on Nathan's shoulder, just for a second, just the weight of a hand, and went toward the barn. Nathan watched him go with a face that had too many things moving across it to name, and then he looked at Evelyn. Thank you, he said, for whatever you said to him before, about me. I told him the truth, she said. That's all I ever do. Nathan almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come to it in her presence, a small, reluctant thing that didn't quite make it to full expression, but that she saw beginning. He said something like that, he said, that you were honest. Is that good or bad? She asked. Depends on the day, he said. She laughed, a short, real laugh, and he looked briefly startled by it, and then the almost smile came back. He picked up his tools and went toward the equipment shed, and she stood at the gate he'd fixed and felt, in the ordinary afternoon light, the weight of everything that the word enough could contain when you let it. Winter came the way winters came in that part of Texas, not with drama, but with a quiet insistence, the air thinning, the mornings going cold and dark earlier each week, the land pulling inward. The ranch pulled inward too, in the particular way of a household that has learned to close ranks against hard weather without closing ranks against each other, which was a different thing entirely and harder to achieve. The kitchen was warm most of the day now. Daniel had taken over the bread, which had been added to the cedar fork order in November. Mrs. Hartley had been right about the demand. And he made it on Tuesday and Friday mornings with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything, and the smell of it moved through the house in a way that Evelyn noticed the boys noticed, even when they didn't say anything about it. You could tell by the way they drifted toward the kitchen at the right hour, not asking for anything, just being near it. She knew what that was. She didn't say it out loud. Some things are better understood quietly. Thomas had declared himself the official keeper of the kitchen herb pots, which had moved inside for the winter and now occupied the sunniest windowsill in a row that he defended against all encroachment with territorial seriousness. He had learned the name of each herb and its use, and occasionally deployed this knowledge at dinner in an instructional tone that suggested he felt the rest of the family's herb education was lacking. "That's rosemary," he would say, pointing at what was already on the table. "We know, Thomas," 3 boys would say at once. "I'm just making sure," he would say. Sam and Eli's chickens were producing through the winter, which they had been told might not happen, and which they took as a personal vindication of their management approach. They kept the ledger going. She had looked at it once, briefly, and found it more accurate than she'd expected, and filled with editorial notes that she suspected were Eli's. The margin analysis column included the notation, "Good business needs expansion." She had closed the ledger and said nothing because some things deserved to develop without adult interference. Marcus had turned 16 in November. She had made him a molasses pecan pie, his specific request, delivered with the casualness of someone who knew exactly what he wanted. And he had eaten 2 pieces at dinner and said it was the best one she'd made, which she suspected was only partly true and was primarily 16-year-old diplomacy, and she valued it accordingly. He was helping Nathan with the cattle management now in a serious way, not just the labor but the judgment side of it, which animals to watch, how to read the herd's behavior, what the land was telling you when the grass went dry in a particular pattern. Nathan was teaching him, not formally, not with speeches, but in the daily, parallel way that real knowledge passed between people who worked alongside each other long enough. She watched this sometimes from a distance and thought about what Nathan had said in September. He's going to want this. He's going to want to stay. She thought Nathan was right, and she thought, watching them both, that Nathan was beginning to understand that his own staying, his own choice to root himself here, was something he was making now, not something that had been made for him 3 years ago out of necessity. Those were very different things, and the difference mattered enormously, even if the outcome looked the same from the outside. It was December when Caleb asked her properly. Not in the garden, not in the lamplight over ledgers. He asked her on a Sunday morning when the house was loud with all 6 boys in various states of argument about breakfast in the cold outside and whose turn it was for something, and she was standing at the stove turning bacon in the pan, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and bread from yesterday. He came in from outside, stomping mud from his boots at the door, and poured himself coffee and stood beside her at the stove in the way he'd started doing, so just being there, present, not requiring anything from the proximity. Then he said, quietly enough that it didn't carry over the noise of the boys, "I'd like to make this official, if you're willing." She turned the bacon. "The arrangement?" she said, because she wanted him to say it. "No," he said, "not the arrangement." She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the pan, not at her, which was how he looked at things that cost him something. "You're not good at this," she said. "I know," he said. You could practice." He looked at her then, with the expression of a man who understood he was being gently required to do a thing properly. He set his coffee down. He said, "I would like you to be my wife, not because of the ranch, not because of the boys, because I don't want to manage whatever comes next without you beside me. And because," he stopped, found the rest of it, "because somewhere in the last 8 months you stopped being someone I'd brought into my life and started being part of it. And I'd rather acknowledge that honestly than keep pretending it's just an arrangement." The bacon needed turning. She turned it. "Yes," she said. He picked his coffee back up. "That's it?" "You asked an honest question," she said. "I gave you an honest answer." At the table, Thomas looked up from whatever argument he was having with Sam. "What are you saying yes to?" he demanded. Breakfast, she said. Sit down. She didn't tell them until that evening, after dinner, when the table was cleared and the lamps were lit and everyone was still in their chairs, which rarely happened. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, that she and their father had decided to be properly married, and that she wasn't asking them to feel any particular way about it, and that the only thing she wanted from them was honesty if something was bothering them, because honesty was the only thing she'd ever found worth trading in. There was a silence. Thomas said, "Does that mean you're staying forever?" "That's the idea," she said. He looked at this information with enormous seriousness. "Okay," he said. Then he got down from his chair and came around the table and put his arms around her waist from behind with the sudden total commitment that 7-year-olds brought to physical affection, and held on. She put her hand over his and didn't make a thing of it. Sam said, "Can we get more chickens?" "That's not related," Eli said. "I'm just asking." Daniel looked at the table for a moment, then at her. He gave a single nod that said everything it needed to and nothing extra, which was Daniel. Marcus smiled, a real one, fully present, without the guarded quality she'd seen from him at the beginning. "Good," he said simply. Nathan was at the end of the table. She looked at him last because she always saved the hardest thing for when she'd gathered herself enough to face it directly. He was looking at his hands. Then he looked up. He didn't say anything for a moment. She waited. "She would have liked you," he said. "My mother." He said it with difficulty, each word placed carefully, the way you place things down on unsteady ground. Not immediately, she was stubborn. A pause. But eventually, there were things she could have said to that. She chose not to say any of them because they would have been less than the thing he'd just offered, and she respected him too much to answer something real with something less. "Thank you," she said. "That means something to me." He nodded once and looked back at his hands. Caleb sat at the head of the table and looked at his family. Imperfect, incomplete in ways that would never be fully mended, carrying all the specific damage that years and loss had put in them. And she saw something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple and too fragile a word for what a man like Caleb allowed himself. Something steadier. The look of someone who has come back from somewhere far away and recognized, with some surprise, that he was glad to be home.
What? Such it.
Spring came back the way it always did, without asking permission, without ceremony, just the morning air changing and the ground softening and the light staying a little longer each day until you realized you'd stopped noticing the dark. The garden went back in April. Thomas helped, as he always did now, with rather more authority than he'd had the year before, directing the placement of the herb pots back outside with the confidence of a person managing a transfer he'd done before. She let him direct. She put the seeds in the ground. The bakery had grown over the winter into something that required actual management. 3 stores now, the Cedar Fork contract expanded, a standing order from the hotel in Decker's Mill that had come through Marge Fielding's relentless ambassadorial work. She had hired a woman from town, a widow named Clara, to help with the baking on the high-volume days, which had the additional effect of giving Daniel someone new to practice the serious business of pie-making alongside. The cattle herd was up to 42 head. Nathan had managed the winter losses better than any comparable year in the ranch's recent history, carefully, with attention to the kind of detail that Evelyn now understood was simply how Nathan paid attention to things he cared about. He had not left. The letter from the Lubbock rancher had never been answered, as far as she knew, and she had never asked him about it because it was not her question to ask. What she knew was that he was here, working this land with an investment that was now fully his own choosing, and that was the only answer that mattered. He had also, sometime in February, started talking to a girl from Decker's Mill. Evelyn knew because Marge Fielding had told her, which was how she learned most things about the town's general awareness of events. She had said nothing about it to Nathan and nothing to Caleb, and she would continue saying nothing until he chose to bring it to the surface himself. Some things needed to move at their own pace. Marcus was 17 and had the look of someone who had decided where he was going to plant himself and was putting down roots accordingly. He talked about the herd the way Nathan talked about the herd, with specificity, with ownership of knowledge, with the unself-conscious ease of someone discussing their own work. He had, in the last month, started going to the county extension meetings with Nathan, which she knew because the feed supplier had mentioned it and which she had quietly noted in the margin of her understanding of who Marcus Dawson was becoming. Daniel had asked, in March, if he could take on the accounting for the bakery side of the business. He had framed it carefully, with the seriousness of someone making a business proposal, explaining that he'd been watching her ledgers for a year and thought he understood the structure and could take it over if she wanted to focus on the supply and production side. She had asked him 3 questions to test his understanding of the accounts. He answered all 3 correctly. She had given him the bakery ledger the next morning. He kept it more neatly than she had. She told him so. He said without looking up from the page, "I learned from a good source." She went back to her own work and didn't say anything else because there was nothing else necessary. The wedding was small, the way she'd wanted it, and Caleb hadn't argued with, which was itself a marker of how far they'd come from 2 people managing a practical arrangement across a kitchen table. A Sunday in May. The yard, which Thomas had taken a proprietary interest in preparing, and which actually looked decent as a result. Marge Fielding and Clara and Pete and a handful of people from Decker's Mill who had watched this woman show up with 2 suitcases and had revised their opinions over 12 months of evidence. 6 boys in clean shirts, Thomas's collar slightly crooked and firmly resistant to correction. She wore a dress she'd made from fabric she'd bought at the mercantile. Not white, that seemed absurd, but a deep blue-gray that suited her, and that she'd made well because she was a practical woman who sewed the way she did everything else, with attention and without fuss. Caleb stood beside her in his good jacket and said what he was supposed to say and meant every word of it in the way he meant things, completely and without decoration. She said what she was supposed to say and meant it in the same way. Nathan stood at the edge of the gathering and watched, and when it was over, he was the first one to shake Caleb's hand. A real handshake, held a beat longer than the formal version, the kind that meant something between 2 people who had found their way back to each other through a hard year. Thomas made a speech that nobody had asked him to make, which lasted 4 minutes and covered topics ranging from the tomato garden to the merit of the molasses pecan pie to a general assessment of Evelyn's character that was more accurate than most adults could have managed. It concluded with the observation that the ranch was better now than it had been before she came, and that this was obviously because of the organization. Everyone laughed, even Nathan. Evelyn looked at this small gathering of imperfect, specific, difficult, hardworking people who had become, in the strange, unplanned way that real things became what they were, her people, and she felt the full, unromantic, genuine weight of it. This was not the life she had planned. She hadn't planned anything, really. She'd answered an advertisement from a practical need, arrived with honest intentions, worked with what was in front of her, and kept her word. And out of those ordinary things, without romance or miracle or anything clean, a life had assembled itself around her. One that fit, not perfectly. There was no perfect. Nathan would always be someone who communicated in work rather than words, and she would always have to read him sideways. Caleb would always struggle to say the full thing on the first try. Thomas would always need the gentle morning, and Daniel would always keep a part of himself private. And Sam and Eli's chicken empire would always require a certain diplomatic management. And she was not herself perfect. She knew that. She was stubborn in her own way, and she could be too blunt. And she still sometimes lay awake at night running numbers that didn't need running at that hour, because that was just how her mind worked, and no amount of belonging had changed it. But she had stopped waiting for the perfect version of things before she let herself want them. That, she thought, might be the only real thing she had figured out in 42 years. That the waiting was the waste. That the life you kept holding at arm's length until conditions improved was the life that slipped past you. You showed up. You worked with what was there. You told the truth and you kept your word, and you stayed when staying was the harder choice. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the thing you walked into with nothing but a blank ledger and a pair of good boots turned out to be exactly the thing you were always supposed to build. That evening, after the guests had gone and the boys were settling and the yard had gone quiet under a May sky going deep blue at the edges, she sat on the porch with Caleb in the 2 chairs they'd pulled side by side months ago and never pulled apart. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The land spread out in front of them in the last of the light, flat and ordinary and particular to itself, the east pasture where the cattle were settled, the garden with its stakes and early growth, The barn with the light still on where she could hear, faintly, Marcus and Nathan finishing up the last of the evening work. Inside, Thomas was telling Daniel something at significant volume about the proper storage of rosemary. From the far end of the house, the chickens made their small, indifferent evening sounds. Caleb reached over and took her hand. Just that. No speech, no ceremony. He held it the way he held things, firmly and without a lot of additional comment. She let herself be held. She thought about the woman who had sat in a laundromat with cold coffee and a newspaper, looking at 11 lines of type and feeling, for the first time in years, the faint pull of a door she hadn't noticed before. That woman had been practical and tired and a little afraid, and she had done the only thing available to her. She had picked up her pen and written toward the unknown with everything honest she had. It had been enough, not because things had worked out neatly. They hadn't. Not because people had changed into better versions of themselves overnight. They hadn't done that either. But because enough people, in enough moments, had chosen to stay, to keep working, to tell the truth when it was easier to be quiet, to let someone help when the instinct was to refuse. That was all any of it had ever been. Nothing miraculous. Just people, making the hard choice repeatedly until the hard choice became the life. The light finished going. The first stars came out over the flat Texas dark. Evelyn Hart. Evelyn Dawson. Now, though it would take her a few weeks to stop catching herself on that, sat on the porch of the ranch she had helped save, beside the man she had chosen and who had chosen her, and listened to the sounds of a family that had forgotten how to be one, learning, slowly and imperfectly, to remember. She was exactly where she was. It was enough. It was more than enough.